Here we're going to move ahead to a few other thinkers who have been quite important, influential in the creation of the fall up. The first I'd like you to know about is John Locke. In the 17th century, he lived from 1632 to 1704, and he first tied together the idea of democracy with land ownership, which he advocated for. He had proletarian ideals, the idea that working the land shows merit, and therefore it deserved a vote, a say in how governments run. And he argued for the limits of ownership, but only so much as one could cultivate. But he also said it's okay to buy labor in order to expand. And so that opened the way for democracy to be tied with land ownership and private ownership of other natural and human resources as well. This was also tied together with God's intentions. This began the enclosure of the commons, and it began the seeds of what we now have as the WTO, the Hawaii takeover, the idea of unused land as wasted land. It's all about us, people, humans, ownership. Next one is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679. The one quote you probably are very familiar with is he said, life. Well, actually, he didn't say this. This is a Renaissance thing, but he brought up life and nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. God doesn't exist. Competitive self-interest is the basis of human relations. Everything, in his view, was reducible to natural and material events. Competition is therefore inevitable for goods and power. Nature is chaotic and dangerous, and we have to fight for survival. It is every man for himself. Human nature is competitive self-interest. And market contracts are all that keep us civilized, and what we own determines our worth. Here's another one I don't think I'd like to have had around as a family member. Thomas Paine argued for natural rights, the primacy of the individual over the collective or the state. This is also, by the way, the time of the Industrial Revolution coming in. And Protestant Calvinism, well, actually, we got the Declaration of Independence, which also valued the individual over society. Yeah, there's some in there about collectivism, but mostly the primary allegiance is to look out for yourself. And that's not the Founding Fathers' fault. This is just part of the collective zeitgeist of the time. The last thing I want to bring in as a timeline thing is Protestant Calvinism in the Industrial Revolution, which is the mid to late 1800s through the early 1900s. Protestant Calvinism was a religious movement that thought there should be moral limits on enjoying your wealth. That's a good thing. Good is not enjoying the fruits of your labor. Good is hard work and asceticism. And that philosophy tied with Western territorial expansion and the idea of manifest destiny led to the flourishing of capitalism. Manifest destiny was the idea that if you did well financially, that was the sign that you were in God's favor. And if you did not do well, that was a sign that you were out of God's favor. So you can see some of these seeds still taking part in Republican thinking now. You don't want to take care of the poor because that's just, it's just encouraging them to continue in their slackery ways or their ungodly ways. That the strong father actually will withhold the gift in order to strengthen the wayward son. Manifest destiny was the idea that, yep, it's clear that I deserve these things. I'm doing right, and I can take over this land because God's on my side. And so we had the whole Western expansion and the takeover of native lands, which continues today, and using of those folks to do what we need, do what we think we need in terms of labor. I want to bring up Darwin before we leave, because one last bit was Herbert Spencer tying in with the manifest destiny, the Calvinist view that takeover is a divine calling. Yeah. Pioneering takeovers were our right, and the conscious should use everything in our means. That was sometimes bolstered by a misread of Darwin. Darwin's view is often misinterpreted, saying that he said survival of the fittest. So get out of my way, buckwheat. But he never said that. Not originally. Originally, Darwin said it's survival of the fit. And by fit, what he meant was those who best fit into the environment, who can adapt, who are resilient. And Herbert Spencer came along, 1820 to 1903, and he added the EST to fit. So then it became survival of the fittest, inventing social Darwinism. And that created the myth of progress as a good idea, and also a ferocious competition that it has a different quality than it does in Darwin. For example, in Darwin, you might have a tree, and some birds always move up, and some birds always move down, and therefore they found their niches. That's survival of the fit. It isn't all the birds are suddenly going to hack it out because we all want to go up and find the bugs that are only on the bottom strata. This isn't how it works. You see the difference? Well, there it was. There it was. This was not the easiest thing to see, I know. I guess one of the things I want to point out in bringing this to you is how really very short a time this was. Sometimes we read the paper or we have arguments with people or discussions with people and they say, well, you know, this is just the way it is. Maybe you feel it yourself. You go into this despair, like, how can this ever change? How can this ever change? It's always been this way. It has not always been this way. This is such a short, anomalous blip in the history of us as a species. And now you can see some of the very discrete leverage points, the very specific changes in our thinking that have led to this. You can see that it doesn't take a whole lot to change a whole culture's thinking. And you and I are part of a movement right now to enact another great shift, a great shift that will change us from being in the sixth great extinction to the great turning, as Joanna Macy puts it, toward a life-sustaining society. A turn back to sane relationship with the more than human world, with animals, with the soil, between men and women. Thanks very much for being part of that.